Winter today means heaters, hot showers, and complaining your coffee cooled down too fast. In the Middle Ages, winter meant filth, smoke, parasites, hallucinations, and sleeping next to livestock just to stay alive. No heat, no hygiene, no mercy. These aren't myths or exaggerations. These are the 44 grossest, most uncomfortable truths about surviving a medieval winter. And by the end, modern life is going to feel like a luxury spa. 1. Sleeping with farm animals was the brilliant medieval solution to the fact that houses had zero insulation and winter was freezing. Families would drag their massive oxen and pigs right into the bedroom because a 1,000-pound cow acts like a giant, breathing radiator that runs on grass. The downside to this organic heating system was that your roommate was a barnyard animal that had no concept of toilet training or personal space. You stayed warm thanks to the body heat, but the air in your house was basically a thick fog of ammonia and animal farts. It was a cozy slumber party where you woke up smelling like a manure pile, but at least your toes didn't fall off from frostbite during the night. 2. Avoiding showers was actually considered top-tier medical advice because doctors were convinced that being clean would kill you. The logic was that hot water opened up your pores and let the cold winter air sneak inside your body to shut down your organs. To stay safe, people let layers of sweat and grime build up on their skin to form a crusty, waterproof shield against the elements. You were walking around in a suit of armor made entirely of your own filth, which is disgusting but was seen as a sign of great health. By the middle of winter, everyone smelled like a locker room that hadn't been cleaned in a century, but nobody cared because they were too busy staying alive inside their dirt shells. 3. The perpetual stew was a culinary disaster that sat on the fire for months without anyone ever bothering to wash the pot. The cook would just throw new cabbage or salted pork on top of the brown sludge that had been bubbling away since November. This meant you were often eating a spoonful of carrots from yesterday, mixed with microscopic bits of a rabbit, that was thrown in 3 weeks ago. It was a flavor profile that can best be described as hot garbage water. But since fuel was expensive, nobody was going to waste heat starting a new soup from scratch. You just closed your eyes, swallowed the gray mush, and hoped the boiling temperature killed whatever new bacteria had moved into the cauldron. 4. Floor hygiene was non-existent because sweeping the floor meant opening the door and letting all the precious heat escape. Instead of cleaning up dropped food, dog poop, or spilled ale, people just covered the mess with a fresh layer of straw called rushes. Over the course of a long winter, these layers would pack down into a solid, fermenting lasagna of trash that you walked on every day. It was like living on top of a compost heap that was slowly rotting right inside your living room. The smell coming from the ground was probably strong enough to peel paint, but it added a nice spongy texture to the floor while breeding an entire ecosystem of bugs under your feet. 5. Changing your clothes was out of the question, so people would literally sew themselves into their woolen underwear for the season. Once the cold weather hit, you put on your thickest tunic and didn't take it off until the birds started singing in the spring. This created a dark and sweaty paradise for body lice to raise their large families right against your skin. Since you were stitched into the fabric, you couldn't even scratch the itch, so you just had to accept that you were a walking, all-inclusive resort for parasites. You spent the entire winter being a buffet for tiny bugs while trapping 4 months of body odor inside a wool sack that you were wearing. 6. Laundry day in January required a special detergent that came straight from your own bladder because going to the river was impossible. Since soap was expensive and water was frozen, people stored their stale urine in jars near the fire to use as a chemical cleaner for greasy wool clothes. The ammonia in Old Pea is actually a fantastic stain remover, but it meant your freshly washed winter outfit smelled exactly like a urinal in a heat wave. You would strut around the village wearing a tunic soaked in human waste, fully convinced you were clean while smelling like a bathroom accident that had been left in the sun. 7. Central heating usually consisted of a fire pit in the middle of the room with no chimney to suck the smoke out. To keep the heat from escaping, people would seal the roof vents, causing thick wood smoke to fill the house and hover just a few feet above the floor like a toxic cloud. You spent the entire winter crawling around your own living room to avoid suffocation, effectively smoking yourself like a side of bacon. By the time spring arrived, your lungs were coated in soot, and your skin had the distinct, leathery texture of a well-preserved ham hanging in a deli window. 8. Going to the bathroom involved a bucket under the bed because nobody wanted to freeze their backside in an outdoor shack during a blizzard. The chamber pot would sit there all night, slowly filling up and releasing its lovely aroma into the warm, unventilated room while you tried to sleep 3 feet away. If you had a large family, that pot became a very high-stakes game of balance where one wrong move meant spilling the night's collection all over the floor rushes. It was the ultimate test of family bonding to sleep soundly, while your brother used the bucket right next to your ear. 9. Toilet paper was a futuristic dream, so winter wiping required dragging a bag of damp moss inside to thaw out by the fire. People would collect piles of moss in autumn and store them for the winter months, but the damp plant matter would often get moldy or freeze into abrasive clumps. Wiping with frozen vegetation is a wake-up call that no amount of caffeine can match, and it often left you with a rash that made sitting down a daily challenge. You were essentially sanding your sensitive areas with cold garden weeds and hoping you didn't grab a handful that had a hibernating spider inside. 10. Privacy was a concept that simply did not exist when the temperature dropped low enough to turn you into a human icicle. Travelers at inns and large families would sleep 3 or 4 people to a single bed, often with complete strangers, just to steal their body heat. You might fall asleep spooning a blacksmith you just met who hasn't bathed since October and smells like onions and wet dog. It was a mandatory cuddle puddle where you ignored the snoring, the smells, and the fleas just so you didn't freeze to death before sunrise. 11. The ultimate medical cure for a winter chest cold involves slathering your entire upper body in a thick layer of goose grease or rendered lard. Since cough syrup didn't exist, the logic was that coating your chest in animal fat would trap the heat inside and bake the sickness right out of your lungs. This meant you spent weeks walking around with a shirt that was permanently glued to your skin by a layer of rancid poultry oil. You essentially smelled like a walking Christmas dinner that had been left out in the sun, and the grease acted as a magnet for every piece of dirt and lint in the house, turning your torso into a sticky, fuzzy fly trap. 12. Hydration was strictly an alcoholic activity because drinking cold water in winter was seen as a quick way to freeze your stomach and die. Instead of coffee, people started their morning with a caudle, which was basically warm, thickened beer mixed with spices and sometimes an egg. You were essentially knocking back a hot alcoholic soup for breakfast just to get the calories and warmth needed to face the day. It wasn't uncommon for the entire family to be slightly buzzed by noon, which was probably the only way to tolerate the fact that you were freezing, smelling like a goat, and covered in goose grease. 13. Windows were a luxury that usually didn't include actual glass, so you had to rely on sheets of linen soaked in animal fat to keep the wind out. The grease made the fabric translucent enough to let a tiny bit of murky light in, but it also meant your window was made of food. In the winter, these greasy sheets would freeze stiff, but as soon as the sun hit them, they would soften up and release the smell of rancid lard into the room. It was a structural element that attracted flies and hungry rats, so you often had to defend your windows from being eaten by the local wildlife. 14. Your mattress was just a large sack stuffed with straw that served as a winter hibernation spot for every rodent in the neighborhood. Since the floor was cold and wet, mice and rats would burrow into the straw bedding to share your body heat, meaning you slept on top of a wriggling ecosystem. The rustling noise you heard right next to your ear wasn't the wind. It was a family of field mice building a condo inside your pillow. You basically agreed to a truce where you provided the warmth and they provided the insomnia by scratching around under your ribs all night long. 15. Indoor lighting relied on tallow candles made from rendered animal fat because beeswax was way too expensive for a peasant budget. Tallow is basically hard beef fat, so when you lit a candle to see in the long winter darkness, it didn't smell like lavender or vanilla. It smelled like a hamburger joint catching on fire. The smoke was thick, black, and greasy, coating your walls and your lungs in a layer of soot. Plus, since your light source was made of meat byproducts, You had to hide your candles in a metal box when you went to sleep so the rats wouldn't steal them for a midnight snack. 16. By late February, the village grain supply would often get damp and infected with a toxic mold called ergot, turning breakfast into an accidental psychedelic trip that would put Woodstock to shame. This fungus contains the raw chemical components of LSD, so starving peasants eating moldy rye bread would suffer from a condition called St. Anthony's fire, which caused burning sensations and massive hallucinations. Imagine being trapped in a dark, freezing hut during a blizzard, trying to stay warm, while your grandmother starts screaming that she's fighting a dragon and the walls are melting into snakes. It wasn't uncommon for an entire family to be absolutely high as kites for weeks, sitting around the hearth terrified of imaginary demons because their toast was technically a hallucinogenic drug. 17. Since Kleenex boxes weren't sitting on every table, managing a runny winter nose involved using the only absorbent material available, which was usually your own sleeve. Over the course of a 4-month winter with a constant cold, the wool fabric on a peasant's forearm would become saturated with layers of mucus that would freeze, thaw, and refreeze. By the time spring arrived, the sleeve had hardened into a crusty, fossilized gauntlet of green slime that could practically deflect an arrow. It was a biological shield of solidified snot that you wore to dinner, to church, and to bed, effectively turning your arm into a walking petri dish that showcased every illness you had survived since November. 18. If you got sick with a winter flu, the doctor wouldn't check your blood pressure. He would perform a uroscopy, which is a fancy way of saying he would stare at, smell, and yes, literally taste your urine. The physician would hold a flask of your morning pee up to the light like a sommelier inspecting a fine vintage Merlot, looking for clouds or bubbles to diagnose your imbalance. Then, to be absolutely sure, he might take a sip to check for sweetness or bitterness, swirling it around his mouth right there in your living room. You had to sit there and watch a grown man gargle your bathroom waste to tell you that you had a cold, which is a level of medical awkwardness that modern healthcare can never match. 19. Dating in the freezing winter months was a logistical nightmare that led to the bizarre tradition of bundling, which is basically the most frustrating sleepover in history. Since it was too cold to stand outside and talk, teenage couples were allowed to share a bed to stay warm, but they were often sewn into separate sacks or had a heavy wooden bundling board placed between them. Parents would essentially burrito wrap their daughter and tuck her in next to her boyfriend, trusting that the thick wool and a plank of wood would prevent any funny business. It was a courtship method that combined the intimacy of a honeymoon with the comfort of being a mummy, forcing young lovers to shout sweet nothings across a barrier of timber while immobilized in fabric. 20. Attending winter mass involved a ritual called the Kiss of Peace, which was essentially a mandatory super spreader event for the entire parish. Instead of shaking hands, the priest would pass around a wooden or metal object called a pax board that had a holy image on it, and every single person in the freezing, coughing congregation had to kiss it. You would watch the village drunk, the guy with the oozing cold sore, and the lady with the hacking cough all smooch this plank, and then it was your turn to press your lips against the exact same wet spot. It was a communal transfer of saliva that ensured if one person had the flu, the entire village would be dying in bed by Wednesday. 21. Fine dining in January usually consisted of a culinary atrocity known as stockfish, which was basically cod that had been air-dried until it was harder than a baseball bat. This fish was so rock-solid that before you could even think about cooking it, you had to take it out to the shed and beat it aggressively with a sledgehammer for an hour, just to shatter the fibers. You were essentially sitting down to a dinner of rehydrated roof shingles that tasted like salty leather and required a jaw strength usually reserved for crocodiles. Chewing this rubbery nightmare was a full-body workout that probably burned more calories than the fish actually provided, leaving you exhausted, hungry, and angry at a dead fish. 22. Navigating the winter streets required specialized safety equipment called pattens, which were clumsy wooden platforms you strapped over your regular shoes to act as poop stilts. The roads weren't just covered in snow, they were a treacherous slushy of mud, ice, animal dung, and garbage that could swallow a person's foothole. These high-heeled clogs elevated you a few inches above the toxic street lasagna, but they were incredibly unstable. making everyone look like drunk ballerinas trying to balance on blocks of wood. One wrong step meant plunging your ankle deep into a freezing mixture of sewage and slush that would stain your soul forever. 23. Hair care routines were completely abandoned in October because getting your head wet was viewed as a fast-track ticket to pneumonia and death. Instead of washing, people would just let the natural oils build up under their heavy wool hoods, creating a grease trap that could practically waterproof a boat. To combat the feeling of having a slime-covered scalp, they would dust their hair with flour or ashes to soak up the oil, which eventually turned into a paste. By midwinter, you were walking around with a matted, doughy helmet on your head that smelled like a rancid bakery and probably housed a small colony of confused beetles. 24. If you were rich enough to avoid freezing sheets, you didn't use an electric blanket, you used a human bed warmer, which is exactly as demeaning as it sounds. A wealthy lord would force a servant or a small child to strip down and lie in the master's freezing bed for 20 minutes before bedtime to absorb the cold with their own body heat. This human sacrifice would shiver uncontrollably to warm up the spot, acting as a biological hot water bottle so the aristocrat could slide into a toasty nest without suffering the indignity of touching cold linen. It was the ultimate flex of privilege, using another living person as a disposable heater because you were too fancy to shiver. 25. The Great Thaw in spring was actually the most disgusting event of the year because the winter snow had been acting as a magical trash concealer for months. All winter long, villagers would lazily throw their chamber pot waste, chicken bones, and rotting garbage out the window, where it would be instantly covered by a fresh, beautiful layer of white snow. It looked like a pristine winter wonderland, but as soon as the sun came out, 4 months' worth of hidden dog turds and fermenting waste would melt and reveal themselves simultaneously. The entire village would instantly transform from a postcard scene into a swamp of thawing filth that released a smell powerful enough to knock a horse unconscious. 26. That fancy 4-poster bed with the velvet canopy wasn't invented for style. It was invented because the ceiling above you was literally alive and frequently went to the bathroom. In winter, every spider, beetle, and mouse in the area would migrate into the warm thatched roof directly above your sleeping body to escape the snow. Gravity is a cruel mistress, so without a canopy, you would wake up with bug droppings, nesting materials, or even the occasional confused rodent falling straight into your open mouth while you snored. The canopy acted as a literal umbrella for pest waste, catching all the debris so you could sleep soundly underneath a suspended pile of insect filth that you had to shake out in the morning. 27. Living in a stone castle sounds romantic until you realize that stone is basically a giant sponge that absorbs moisture and holds onto the cold like a grudge. Unlike peasant huts, which were small and easy to heat, a castle was a massive, drafty freezer where the walls would literally sweat from the condensation caused by the temperature difference. This constant dampness meant that expensive tapestries were actually mold farms, hiding slick, green slime growing on the masonry behind them. You could be the richest duke in the land, but you were still spending your winter shivering in a wet gray cave that smelled like a basement flood, wearing 3 fur coats just to eat dinner without your teeth chattering. 28. Using the toilet in a castle involved visiting the garderobe, which was essentially a hole in a stone bench that opened directly over the moat or a cesspit far below. The problem in winter is that a stone shaft acting as a toilet tube also functions as a perfect wind tunnel for Arctic gusts blowing up from the bottom. When you sat down to do your business during a blizzard, you were greeted by a high-velocity blast of freezing air shooting straight up the chute and targeting your most sensitive areas. It was a bathroom experience that combined the relief of emptying your bladder with the sensation of sitting on an industrial air conditioner, leaving you with a frostbitten backside before you could even finish. 29. Since refrigerators were centuries away, the only way to store meat for the winter was to hang it from the rafters of your main living room to keep it dry and smoked. This meant that your interior decoration scheme consisted of salted ham hocks, strings of sausages, and dried fish dangling just a few feet above your head while you tried to relax. As the house warmed up from the fire, these preserved carcasses would sometimes sweat fat or brine, dripping salty grease onto your hair or into your lap. You were effectively living inside a crowded deli counter, sharing your personal space with a dozen dead animals that stared at you with hollow eyes while you told bedtime stories to your children. 30. By the time March rolled around, the complete lack of fresh vegetables and vitamin C meant that half the village was unknowingly suffering from the early stages of scurvy. It wasn't just for pirates. Landlocked peasants would notice their gums becoming strangely spongy and their teeth getting loose in their sockets after months of eating only bread and salted pork. Your breath would smell absolutely terrible because your mouth was essentially slowly rotting while you were still using it. It was a season where biting into a piece of hard, crusty bread was a risky gamble that might result in leaving a tooth behind, all because you hadn't seen a salad since October. 31. Since IKEA hadn't invented ceramic plates yet, your dinnerware was usually a stale, rock-hard slab of bread called a trencher. You would pile your greasy stew directly onto this crusty carbohydrate, allowing the gravy and meat juices to soak into the bread while you ate. By the end of the meal, your plate had transformed into a soggy, disintegrating mush that had absorbed the saliva from your spoon and the table grime. If you were really hungry, you would eat this saturated carb frisbee yourself, effectively consuming your own dirty dishes. If you were feeling generous, you tossed it to the dog or the poor, handing them a piece of bread that was 10% wheat and 90% backwash and grease. 32. The winter diet relied heavily on preserved beans, cabbage, and onions, which are the holy trinity of flatulence, turning the average peasant home into a pressurized gas chamber. Because the windows were sealed shut with animal fat and the door was blocked to keep the heat in, there was absolutely nowhere for the bodily gases to escape. A family of 7, all eating fermented cabbage and sleeping in one room, created a Dutch oven effect on a massive scale. You were breathing air that was composed of 50% oxygen and 50% recycled grandfather farts, creating a domestic atmosphere that was warm, cozy, and smelled like a compost heap that had exploded. 33. To avoid freezing toes in bed, people would heat large stones or bricks in the fireplace and wrap them in old rags to place at the bottom of the mattress. It was a primitive version of an electric blanket, but with a much higher risk of setting your legs on fire while you dreamed. If the rag slipped or the stone was too hot, you would wake up to the smell of singed wool and the sensation of your foot being grilled like a panini. You had to constantly play a game of footsie with a scorching hot rock, trying to get just close enough to steal the warmth without accidentally branding yourself in your sleep. 34. Socializing at the local tavern was a high-risk activity because separate glasses for customers were considered an unnecessary extravagance. Instead, the ale was served in a large communal vessel that was passed from person to person, meaning you were swapping saliva with every single guy in the village. You would watch the blacksmith, who had a hacking cough and hadn't brushed his teeth since the fall of Rome, take a giant swig, and then it was your turn to put your mouth on the exact same rim. It was a game of backwash roulette, where you enjoyed your beer with a side order of everyone else's flu virus and gum disease. 35. Buying a new pair of leather boots for winter meant walking around smelling like a public toilet because of the bizarre tanning process. Medieval tanners used a mixture of dog poop and stale urine to cure the leather, as the chemicals in the waste helped soften the hide and remove hair. This meant that fresh winter footwear retained a very distinct earthy aroma that didn't just fade away overnight. When you walked into a warm room wearing your brand new kicks, the heat would reactivate the scent, announcing your arrival with a fragrance that smelled like you had just stepped into a kennel that hadn't been cleaned for a month. 36. Men's fashion met survival in the most ridiculous way possible with the codpiece, which was essentially a padded helmet for a guy's nether regions. While it looked like a desperate attempt to show off, in the dead of winter, this fabric pouch was a critical piece of thermal engineering stuffed with wool, sawdust, or old rags. It acted as a dedicated insulator to keep the most sensitive parts of the male anatomy from getting frostbite and falling off in the sub-zero wind. You were walking around with a literal pillow stuffed down your pants, looking like an absolute clown to anyone from the future, but resting easy knowing that your family line was warm and protected by a cushion of sawdust. 37. Winter beauty standards were absolutely toxic because spending 4 months inside a smoke-filled hut turned your skin a sickly, soot-stained gray. To fix this zombie complexion, women would plaster their faces with a thick white foundation made from lead and vinegar, which is chemically a corrosive poison. This heavy makeup would slowly eat away at their actual skin, causing nasty scars and blemishes, so they would just pile on even more lead paint to cover the damage. It was a horrific cycle where you looked pale and trendy for the winter festival, but your face was literally rotting off underneath the mask because your moisturizer was made of heavy metals. 38. Walking down a narrow street in January was like playing a high-stakes video game where the enemies attack you from the sky. Since indoor plumbing was centuries away, people emptied their brimming chamber pots directly out of second-story windows, often with a warning shout that nobody actually heard. In the freezing air, the liquid waste would partially solidify on its way down, turning into a slushy projectile of frozen poop that could knock a grown man unconscious. You had to constantly scan the windows above you, knowing that one wrong step could result in you wearing a hat made of someone else's frozen breakfast that had just been launched from a bedroom. 39. Baking bread in your own home was impossible because heating a private oven required way too much expensive firewood. Instead, the whole village had to trudge through the snow to use a massive communal oven, handing over their raw dough to a sweaty baker who touched everyone's food with his bare hands. Families would mark their unbaked loaves with dirty sticks or their thumbs to tell them apart, meaning your bread was baking on a floor covered in ash and rat droppings, right next to your neighbor's questionable dough. You were essentially eating a loaf that had swapped germs with the entire zip code, enjoying a community crust that tasted like smoke and strangers. 40. For the men of the village, a thick winter beard wasn't just a facial warmer, it was a disgusting storage unit for leftover snacks. Without napkins or forks, messy stews and soups would inevitably get stuck in the hair around the mouth, where the freezing temperatures would turn the droplets into savory icicles. A man would walk around all day with bits of cabbage, gravy, and snot frozen solid into his mustache, effectively saving a portion of his lunch for later. When he finally sat close to the fire in the evening, his face would begin to thaw, releasing a steady warm drip of old food juice down his chin that smelled exactly like last week's dinner. 41. The medieval waste management system consisted entirely of a herd of hungry pigs roaming the snowy streets, acting as biological vacuum cleaners. Since sewer systems didn't exist, villagers would throw their night soil, which is a polite way of saying human poop, out the window into the snow, where the pigs would happily gobble up the frozen brown treats like they were candy bars. It was a seemingly efficient system until you realized that come Christmas feast, you were slaughtering and eating the exact same pig that had been binge-eating your family's bathroom waste all winter long. You were effectively participating in a disgusting culinary circle of life, where you ate the pig ate your waste, and the cycle continued in a horrifying loop of agricultural recycling. 42. If the freezing wind gave you painful chilblains or raw sores on your feet, the local doctor wouldn't prescribe a soothing lotion. He would tell you to wrap your toes in a poultice of fermented pigeon droppings. The medical theory was that the heat from the bird manure would draw out the cold and heal the skin, meaning you were intentionally marinating your open wounds in literal feces to feel better. You had to limp around the house with your feet bandaged in bird waste, hoping that the infection from the poop didn't kill you faster than the frostbite, all while trailing the distinct, eye-watering scent of a dirty chicken coop everywhere you walked. 43. Fighting off the winter flu often involved a medicine called mumia, which is exactly what it sounds like: the ground-up remains of ancient Egyptian mummies. Wealthy Europeans believed that eating the dust of long-dead bodies would transfer their life force to the living, so they essentially engaged in casual cannibalism just to get through the cold season. You would sit by the fire, sipping a warm drink mixed with the pulverized flesh of a guy who died 3,000 years ago, convincing yourself that eating a corpse was the height of medical sophistication. It was a health craze that proves people will swallow literally anything, even a dead pharaoh, if a doctor tells them it will stop a runny nose. 44. The absolute worst job in history belonged to the gong farmer. the brave soul tasked with cleaning out the castle cesspits when they filled up. While summer cleaning was smelly, winter cleaning required mining through solid blocks of frozen human waste with a pickaxe because the contents of the pit had turned into a brown iceberg. These guys had to descend into the dark hole and aggressively chip away at the stalagmites of sewage by candlelight, often getting hit in the face by flying shards of frozen filth. It was a career path that combined the claustrophobia of coal mining with the indignity of standing inside a giant toilet, and they were the only people in the village who never got a hug at the winter festival. Now be honest, after hearing all this, would you actually survive a medieval winter? Or would you be dead by week 2 from smoke, disease, or pure disgust? Pick one exact thing from this list that would break you first and explain why in the comments. No heroic answers allowed. If this video made you grateful for heating, showers, and toilets, hit like. Subscribe if you want more history that ruins your comfort on purpose.